your books, you have 3, have served as a sort of time capsule in your life, from which you've derived some extraordinary wisdom for us at large. You grew up in a Cleveland suburb where you lived out the life of an average American kid while having a secret, private Indian world at home, replete with custom and tradition. Seeking to rediscover your roots on your own terms, you moved to India after college to the shock of your parents, who had tried so hard to leave the country. And the result was the brilliant book, India Calling, an intimate portrait of a nation's remaking. Next, you went to Texas to capture the story of a Bangladeshi immigrant who was shot in a hate crime in the days following 9/11. And emerged with an incredible portrait of forgiveness and change in the true American. Throughout all of these experiences, you've said that the question, where are you from, has been a defining part of your life. And I'm wondering if you can start by telling us a bit more about why that question is so important to you.
Yeah. Like many of us who live in New York, like many of you in this room, it's a question I've been asked a lot in my life. I guess everybody's asked it a certain amount, and some of us are asked it a little more. I was asked that question, and it was a defining question because we were Indian immigrants. My parents were immigrants in Cleveland, Ohio in the 80s, and our presence in many of the spaces we were in was sometimes, unusual. My people would ask my mother, what's that red dot in your head? Is that blood? And there's a hole, and there's blood coming out of the hole, or people would have a kind of curiosity, but not exactly be able to place us. And of course, that was still a time, and frankly, it's not fully gone yet, when Americanness and whiteness were conflated in many people's imaginations, and a darker skin color was kind of created a presumption of foreignness.
Of other.
Which only maybe the right paperwork could overcome. And so that's kind of one aspect of the where are you from question. But as you said, I tried to think about what the ultimate betrayal of my parents would be, and moving to the country they worked very hard to get out of was a really good one. So I moved to India after college, as you said, and did so because I wanted to rediscover my roots, but also because I wanted to become a writer, and that kind of confrontation with something that is actually difficult. I had a difficult relationship with India. I didn't like it. The first fact I knew about it was my parents wanted to get out of it. And I had a sense that going there and confronting it would actually help make me a writer, which turned out to be a really true thing. I think if I'd done anything safer, it may not have happened for me. And when I got to India, there was a whole new round of where, I was thinking, finally, I'm not like the brown guy in Ohio. People are going to stop asking me, where am I from? And here's a whole nation where people sort of look like me. Turns out not so easy. People would say, we can tell you're American by the way you walk.
Really?
Yeah.
I wonder, there's an American way of walking?
It's like you walk in a way that looks like you're about to invade some other country.
Swagger.
Yeah. Like the swagger backed by very powerful armed forces. And so people would all the time ask me, where are you from? And I have this whole moment in India Calling where I describe, so I'd say, and I knew, just as I knew in America what they were getting at, which is like, it's always like, where are you really from? Right? That's the, impolite. So I in America, what I knew they were getting at, So in India, where are you from? And I would, again, try to mess with them and just be like, Washington, D.C., my family lives. Yeah, but where are you from? I was like, well, my parents are Indian. Yeah, obviously, but India's really big. Where in India? It's very important to Indian people. Well, my mom's from the north, Punjabi. My dad's from the south, Tamil Nadu. Now in India, this is like saying, one is a horse and the other is a snake. I mean, it's like, how do they meet? you know? I'd be like, well, they met studying French in Bombay. And people would just be like, oh my God, oh my God. It's like saying they met on a porn shoot, right? Whew, whew. Such brazen miscegenation while learning French.
Ooh la la.
Yeah, exactly. It's like every Indian parent's thing of like why you shouldn't let your kids study French. And then they'd be like, but your name, Giridharadas, it doesn't quite. And I was like, so that your mother is Tamil? No, my father. Oh, got it. So basically, you're Tamil. I was like, no, I didn't say that. I'm a parent from each. My mother, you know. And so then again, there was this like whole thing in India where I'd like gone back to my roots, and like that wasn't enough for them, and I was kind of foreign there. And then of course, in a much darker way, the True American starts the story of the True American, this hate crime, right? You know, it's 3 shootings right after 9/11, and one of the two of these gas station workers are killed, and the third one survives. And I tell the story of the survivor, who ends up forgiving his attacker. It's white supremacist. And the first question the white supremacist asks, the only question, the only thing he says, he walks into the gas station, he sees the guy, and he says, where are you from? And my character, Race, had been, I say character, he was a real person, he'd been robbed several times that summer. So for him, it was like, why would someone ask that? I mean, like, that's, money talks, right? Like what? Like it didn't compute with his understanding of the robbery that he thought was underway. So he said, "Excuse me," and the accent in those 2 words was enough to betray him. And the next thing the guy did was shoot him in the face. So I think, and I'm sorry, I'm going to tell one more version of that story because I think it's so, you know, so. All those stories are in a way fraught and about how people are trying to pin people down, and people can't. I mean, so many of us in this room belong to more than one place, right? In one way or another, psychographically, demographically, geographically. But I want to tell the final story is actually about how those of us who are from more than one place can sometimes, because we've had to deal with this so much, can sometimes be defensive in a way that's uncharitable and misses opportunities.
For example?
A few years ago here in New York, we had our stove broke. I had to replace the stove. And that's a kind of big thing to get into your house. And there were 2 or 3 attempts at delivery, and they broke the stove on the way to the house like 2 times.
Ooh.
A lot of glass and whatever. And so, and so we were like pretty angry by the, we were like in New York, we order takeout every day anyway, so it wasn't that big a deal, but still. In theory, you want a stove at least. You want to put your shoes in.
I use mine as a bread box.
Yeah, we had no shoe storage. And so we called PC Richards, and we really complained, and the manager of the store is like, I will come to your house myself and supervise the, so great. So the guy comes, and his guys are doing the thing, and he's kind of got nothing to do. He's just making sure it doesn't shatter. And he's standing, and he was like a white guy, 50 years old, mustache, kind of like working class guy made good, maybe from Long Island. I mean, I'm imagining here.
It sounded like you just described my brother.
Exactly. He was actually your brother. And he's here today. No, I'm just kidding. And so at some point, he says, where are you from? And I had that moment of like, who the fuck are you? You're in my house installing my 3rd stove, right? Like, who are you to like ask for my papers? But I would say most of the time I kind of go that way, like, or just say an answer that's defiant, like, Ohio. Or if I'm feeling frisky, I say, I'm one of the original Cleveland Indians.
This man deserves his own show.
Yeah. But this time I decided, I don't know why, maybe I'd had like coffee or something, and I said, I was born in Ohio, but my family's Indian. 'Cause I knew what he wanted, and for some reason I was like, I'm gonna give it to him. And he looks at me like relieved, like there was something he wanted to say, but like didn't know if it was okay to say, like tense, fearful, not able to have this conversation as easily as maybe I could. And he says, oh, I thought so. He said, I come from a family that's not very good. We don't get along, very tense, terrible family. But my brother married a woman from India, and she changed our whole family, and she's the light of our lives. That was it. And I have always thought about that moment because he was trying to have a conversation he didn't know how to have. And the way people in our world, I don't mean to speak for you, but in our kind of liberal cosmo world, rightfully deal with that situation often, it just made me sad. Like, how often are we missing the opportunity to have the moment that he was actually trying to have? That could have gone in a way of intolerance, but actually this was this guy from a background where he wasn't raised to like voice what he was trying to say perfectly, but who actually felt like the one contact with India he'd had in his life had changed his whole family. And because of, whether you call it PC or just the kind of norms around like not assuming things, we might not have ever had that conversation. Right. And so I often think about, how do we build an America in which like being a little darker is not a presumption of guilt of foreignness, but in which we're also not like joyless and unable to deal with the fact that, yeah, we are from all over the world and there are stories behind that. And if we all just pretend like we don't recognize each other's differences, we're never going to share those stories.
One of the things that is embedded in this sort of socialization of the way we respond to other is that the other is somehow inferior. And that's something that I think is the most damaging, that you have a suspicion or an intention of creating a hierarchy when you ask that question. It's not just a curiosity question, where are you from? I love traveling. I wonder if I've ever been to wherever you were born. It's, where are you from, so that I can place you, so that I can determine where in my hierarchy you fit. And in the Daily Show, in 2011, you were on the Daily Show, and you said, as a child, the only thing you don't want to be is different from people, is different. How can we start to think about difference as non-threatening? Because that's what we're so in the midst of now. It's difference as threatening. It's difference as dangerous. How do we rise above that?
Look, that is the central question of American life today. I'll say a couple things. One, we are obviously going through an incredibly bleak moment, right? But I sometimes think we are ungenerous to ourselves when we think about why we're going through this moment. We're not just going through this because of Orange Mussolini.
Hashtag.
We are actually trying to do something incredibly hard right now on a like 50-year, 100-year scale that I think, I mean, maybe there's some very old, I don't think any superpower has basically ever done in history, which is to become a country without a majority. To become, I mean, America's on track to basically become this like subset of humanity, right? Like people from humanity cherry-picked into one country with, I know that it feels very hard to imagine that right now when white nationalism runs this country and we're separating kids on the border and women are being degraded from the highest office in the land every day. But I also think we have to be mindful of the bigger arc of history. Like, all that stuff is happening, the bad stuff, because we're actually on this quite inexorable path that is terrifying to a lot of people. And we are trying to do something that is actually really incredible. And it is incredible enough that for many, many years to come, it is going to inspire many people to take the route you described, which is conflating difference with otherness and with inferiority. But I think we can't afford to lose sight of the extraordinary thing we're trying to do and the ways in which we're actually doing it.
Give me one example so I can feel optimistic. I've been feeling really, really despairing.
I mean, look around, just look at this room.
There are a lot of party hats.
This room wouldn't look like this when my parents moved to America, right? I'm still in many rooms that are old and problematic, but I'm also in a lot of rooms that are radically new, and I'm sure all of you are too. Just because, like, this is a very dark moment, but this moment is a reaction to the thing. I mean, Michelle Goldberg, I think, had this great column where she, Michelle Alexander, had this great column where she talked about, we're not the resistance. Trump's movement is the resistance. We're the megatrend. An America that is open and plural and gender equal and tolerant and brings the whole world in, that's the megaforce.
So do you think that this is the last vestiges of the white supremacist?
It's one of the last vestiges. I think there may be a couple more. And by the way, I think the next time it may be someone actually talented. Right? So I don't think we're out of the woods. And I actually think next time maybe someone who knows how to read. Right? And so we have to be very careful. Like, the next time someone wants to deport 11 million people but is literate, that's going to be a real threat, right? We got so lucky. Never has so much hatred been filtered through so much incompetence, right? And we're not.
Let's just stop for a second on that one.
So in no way do I think we're out of the woods, and I spend a lot of my time thinking about how to act in this moment. However, I do think we got into this moment because a lot of us neglected some of these deep forces in our country. And above all, I would say extreme inequality that frankly many good people are complicit in and didn't do enough to stop. And this one is more complicated and controversial. I think about the stove delivery guy, who I think of as a guy in this 50-year mega trend of a new America, a guy who could go either way, right?
Yeah.
The guys in Charlottesville are not going to go either way. You're not going to go, but there's a bunch of people, millions of people, who I think are still undecided on whether they're down with the new America or not, right? Maybe these are the men who would never do what Brett Kavanaugh probably did, but who maybe feel like he was not treated fairly. These are the white people who, like the stove delivery guy, don't quite think it's okay to just ask where you're from because you're dark, but who actually love whatever minorities have entered their life. These are complicated, and there are millions of these people. And I actually think in spaces like ours, and I'm generalizing based on your party hat appearance, I think we are very confused about what to do with those people.
What do you think we should do with those people?
I think we have an enormous interest in making sure they feel like they too belong in the new America that's coming. It's not fair, but unfortunately, the people who are winning the megatrend, who have definitely not won yet, but are winning, need to start thinking now about what kind of victors they're going to be.
No gloating.
And it's very hard to do the no gloating thing when you haven't even won yet, when America's literally being run by white nationalists.
You're that sure that the arc of the moral universe bends
I mean, just
towards
look at
justice?
who's dying and who's being born in America. It's already done. I mean, it's just a question of them growing up, right? They're already here. I mean, you look at the demographics of look at Arizona, right? Maybe the most politically tense state in the country. Why is it the most politically tense? Ooh, interesting. On a map of 50 states, it has the highest spread between the demographics of who's dying and who's being born. This is just math, right? And we see, but I think one of the things that I think is not talked about enough in our circles is resisting Trump or kind of immediate protection from the depredations of the Trump administration is a very temporary kind of safety for the new pluralist America we're trying to build. The more durable kind of safety is getting some of those people to go our way, not his way. And that actually requires some real thinking.
Do you think that if we, as the megatrend were more inclusive of those that we consider to be others, we'd be in a better situation?
Correct. And again, like this is tricky territory because it's asking people who are, as I relayed, 3 out of my 4 stories were kind of hostile, where are you from? So it's asking people who are on the receiving end of othering to worry about other people, which is like, it's not your job. But I just worry that we're like building an America that's going to be very hard for us for 50 years if we're not attending to that. And the question I often ask people is like, is there space among the woke for the still waking? And I don't ask that out of like, just love. It's like, I don't think the woke are going to be very safe if we just circle the wagons of the woke. To me, there's zero safety in that. And we're going to be living through the kind of politics we're living in for a long time to come. But I think if we think hard about how do we absolutely defend the values of equality and pluralism and openness while seeking to be a movement of persuasion rather than self-satisfaction.
You write about the prospect of a global civil war. How realistic do you think that is?
I mean, I'm quoting Pankaj Mishra there, this great book, Age of Anger, and he says we're in it now, and that we don't, and it often, I mean, a lot of things like, the Enlightenment. No one in the Enlightenment's like, hey guys, we're in the Enlightenment now. A lot of these things get named later when you put a certain logic on it, of like, hey guys,
the Dark Ages.
Reformation's going great. We're in year 2 of the Reformation. It must have taken a long time to name the 30 Years' War. I mean, no one went into that being like, all right, let's do this the next 30 years. Should we set that in our GCal?
It's all about the positioning.
Yeah. Probably fewer people would have signed up if they'd known the accurate duration. So I think there's like a effort to think like, what is this period we're living in right now? And Pankaj's framing is like, this is maybe a global civil war. He even says maybe it's the third World War, and it's the longest and strangest. And he's talking not just about what's happening here, but he's talking about like, what is ISIS, right? What's all the conflict that grew out of the Arab Spring? How did that then send all these people to Europe? How did that then change the entire political landscape of? If you actually start, how did that affect Trump? And you start thinking about all these interconnected things. Like, there's, why is Brazil and Hungary and all these other countries now going in this kind of
Brexit.
Authoritarian direction, Brexit, et cetera? And so, Pankaj's framing is, and this is very important, that, and Yasha Munk has a great book called The People versus Democracy, where he talks about this too. It's very tempting in each of these countries to think like your own historical dramas are the thing driving this. So here in America, we're like, it's all about race, and it clearly is. But then that kind of doesn't explain why the same thing's happening in countries that like don't have our racial history and have a different racial history. And there's something happening in the world right now in which, my framing for it is like, I think there's a very large coalition of people around the world who feel mocked by the future. And there's a lot of different ways to end up feeling mocked by the future, right? Being white and feeling like whiteness is losing the kind of VIP passes it used to give you is definitely one way to feel mocked by the future. Being a man and feeling like you can't be mediocre anymore and still run the company is definitely, is definitely another way of feeling mocked by the future. Economic inequality, in which right now in our time, this is the first generation of Americans to not be able to pass on as good a life to their kids as them. I mean, that's been the contract in America. The contract broke with our generation. And that's another way to feel mocked by the future. Living in a world in which, billionaires seem to decide everything, and your own kid's public school is run by Mark Zuckerberg, who hasn't been to that city before, but wants to transform it, is another way of feeling mocked by the future. And so I just, and having like Germany take 800,000 people in a single year, which is the most extraordinary humanitarian act in the world in years, for people who are not used to people who are different in a small town, can be experienced as feeling mocked by the future.
Do you think it's mocked? Do you think that there's some sense of being duped as well?
Yep. I think there's mocked, there's duped, I think there's confused, I think there's, there's this emotion of resentment, which is very powerful. I think resentment is, like anger is obvious. Resentment is something that, and Pankaj's book deals a lot with it. It's a very important emotion to understand, and I think it's a very dominant emotion in the world right now.
You talk about the notion of being mocked on a very large scale, or maybe being duped on a very large scale in your new book, Winners Take All, the elite charade of changing the world. And first, congratulations on making the New York Times bestseller list. That is quite, yeah. I want to go back to
right behind Omarosa's book. Yeah.
Congratulations on the New York Times bestseller list. I want to go back to 2015, where you stood before a crowd of a few hundred people at the Aspen Institute and said these powerful, perhaps chilling words to the people in attendance. I want to suggest that we may not always be the leaders we think we are. Can you tell us what prompted that statement and how that went over, and then how that served as the catalyst for this really quite remarkable new book?
So some of you, how many of you have been in like a fellowship of some kind? Yeah. So there are these things, like there's these fellowships all around the world now, and I think they're an interesting cultural phenomenon in their own right, and they're these kind of, they're all different, but there's the Obama Fellowship, there's the Clinton Fellowship, there's the World Economic Forum Fellowship, there's all these fellowships. And the Aspen Institute has this fellowship called the Henry Crown Fellowship, and there's kind of this open secret society, right? And
Of others.
Of others, yeah, exactly. and what this one was trying to do was to help civilize business people. That was the basic idea. You take business people who are good at, like, as they say in The Wire, buying for $1 and selling for $2, and teaching them how to, like, make the world a better place. And the theory of the Aspen Institute's fellowship, this fellowship, was that the world, and this is very common to some of these fellowships, the world's biggest problems can no longer be solved by government. Right? So it starts from a totally fraudulent premise. And therefore, we need entrepreneurs, right? Since that word is French, there's sophistication to it. We need entrepreneurs to solve these problems instead, because, enter fraudulent rest of sentence. And so these fellowships take in a lot of business people, 20 business people a year, and kind of have them read Plato and Aristotle and Gandhi, and this was the tell, Jack Welch, and discuss them and share our lives with each other in secret. And the idea was you'd come out of this process equipped to change the world. Now, 20 business people in a room is obviously very boring. So they always add like 2 or 3 non-business people to stir things up. So I was one of the people to stir it up, the Indian spice. It was a great experience, great fellowship, but I basically started to realize as I went deeper into this Aspen Institute world that it was really paradoxical at the root. Like here we were going to Aspen or these other places talking about how do we make the world a better place in Aspen, to which many people went in private jets. And we would have these conversations, while I would be sitting at a table with like people from Goldman Sachs who were taking breaks to get on conference calls talking about how to like screw the working class. And here we were with people from Facebook and Google in the fellowship who were like, talking about how they're going to create some project to help 12 people in Silicon Valley while they were building the most predatory monopolies maybe in human history. And here we were at the Aspen Ideas Festival talking about health and wellness sponsored by Pepsi and Monsanto. Here we were receiving a lecture on the 13th Amendment from the noted 13th Amendment scholar David Rubenstein, founder of the Carlyle Group private equity firm. Not a noted 13th Amendment scholar. That was irony. Do not spread the idea, because he thinks he's a 13th Amendment scholar. And I mean, all private equity barons of a certain age think they're 13th Amendment scholars.
Why is that?
You know, it's like the kind of issue that it's easy to be against slavery in the 19th century because it kind of, I don't know, absolves them of like the wage slavery that they're involved in creating now with their leverage buyouts that suck all the, you know, the wages and pensions out of companies and make Americans live in this endless cycle of not being able to make it. It's a way of sounding woke without being it.
Well, you reveal that throughout the book, chapter after chapter.
So just to finish that story, like I started to feel very uneasy with this group of people. And they asked me to give a talk, which was not unusual because it's the kind of thing where everybody gives a talk at some point. It's on a panel. And they asked me to give a talk about my hate crime book. I said yes. Then I called and I said it's going to be a little different than that. They said that's fine. Then I inflated little different to being very different. Took the hate crime down to a paragraph and made the whole speech about how the people in the room, a room sort of like this, who were coming together to change the world, might actually be the problem. That we'd actually convened in the room the problem. And there were like a lot of billionaires in the room, millionaires in the room, you know, those kind of, like all of Bernie Sanders' enemies in one room. And it was this extraordinary, weird thing. Some people sat on their hands, some gave me a standing ovation but looked really sad. And one person came up to me afterward and was like, "Que cojones?" And then someone else came up to me and was like, a billionaire came up to me and said, "Thank you for voicing what has been the struggle of my whole life." And then a rich private equity guy at the bar that night came up to me and he's like, "You're an asshole." And then he shook my hand.
White guy, right?
Yeah. Private equity. And, you know, it was this very strange thing, but I often think about my writing, although my writing is not comedic, although, you know, hopefully there's some good lines in there. I think about my project as being comedic in the following sense. I think if you are telling people things that they already know, that's not good. If you're telling people things they've never thought of before, have no relation to their reality, that's also not good. Ideally, you want to tell people things that they've vaguely felt, sensed, thought of, but have stayed within them, or been whispered quietly in pillow talk or at the bar, and you want to elevate that to a level of being out there, right? I always think about like Jerry Seinfeld's line about the second button on men's shirts being the location of it being like totally make or break. If it's a little too low, you're like a European playboy, and if it's a little too high, you're like an uptight prick. And like I remember hearing that line and thinking, like no man has ever said that out loud. Every man immediately understands the truth of that statement and has had that problem their whole life. And that's what I want to do in my writing. And so I think the reason that speech and then fast forward 3 years later to the book, it's gotten that reaction is I'm not saying things in here that people even within those spaces and certainly I don't know, but it was, you know, most people are not dumb enough to be writers. Most people have jobs and are on salaries and can't say the shit they think all the time. And I think what I tried to say in that speech, but then really reported out by spending time with people over the last 3 years, is a lot of the things that privileged and even very rich people feel and realize about their efforts to change the world, while knowing that in many ways they're actually working to keep it the same.
Why are they doing that?
We live in a time of extraordinary inequality. And I think one of the things I learned doing this reporting was extreme inequality creates a dual psychology. On the one hand, if you're a thoughtful person living in a time like this and you read the paper, you understand we're living in a time of inequality, right? If you haven't gotten that memo, like, you probably haven't gotten a lot of memos. And so I think a thoughtful person of privilege at the top of that distribution is going to respond to that in some way. I should do something. My company should do something. I should do something on the side. I should volunteer for this. And I think we see that, right? It is hard to read the newspaper any day without seeing some new billionaire giving away their fortune. It's hard to go to the mall without buying, seeing like a tote bag that's going to change the world, or shoes that are going to be given to someone in Africa. By the way, I've never heard about those shoes actually being given. Anyway, we'll see about that. I'm sure it's in the mail. And we see this great outpouring of elite concern on campuses. Every young person on campus wants to start a social enterprise that will turn poop into coffee and use it to save Rwanda in some way. And yet, that same extreme inequality creates that second psychology, which is it makes it really costly to not be at the top. If you think about a less unequal society, a more equal society, it's great to be at the top, but it's not punishing to be in the middle. Well, think about New York. It is punishing to be in the middle.
It's almost intolerable. You can't do it.
Yes. And so when more and more of our society becomes like New York, which is basically what's happening, in all the bad ways, not the good ways, unfortunately, what happens is you end up with this dual psychology of, I want to help, and I can't afford to not remain at the top of this heap. And the whole book, in a way, is a story of rich people trying to change the world while making sure that their world doesn't change.
Very early on in the book, you set the stage by laying bare some of the dramatic issues that we're facing as a country, and I want to share some of those. You write, a successful society is a progress machine. It takes in the raw material of innovations and produces broad human advancement. America's machine is broken. And you go on to detail that the average pre-tax income of the top 10th of Americans has doubled since 1980. That of the top 1% has more than tripled, and the average pre-tax income of the bottom half of Americans has stayed the same. Meanwhile, we're seeing more health advances than ever before, but the average American's health remains worse than peers in other rich countries. A rich man lives longer than a poor man. We have amazing learning innovations, yet the average 12th grader tests worse in reading skills today than in 1992. We have a culinary renaissance in the form of farmers markets and Whole Food stores, yet obesity and related conditions continue to rise. Soon after reporting these facts, you introduce a key term featured throughout the book. It is the term market world. Can you give our audience a brief introduction to that?
Yeah, I wish Tina had a GIF for it. I think this would be a perfect.
She'll make one.
Yeah. So market world, one word, capital M, capital W. You got to visualize it. I learned a long time ago, just as a writer, the value of coinage. Particularly going back to that Jerry Seinfeld button. If you're going to Antarctica and just trying to tell people about something they absolutely don't know, you don't need coinage. But you just got to say what you saw. But if you, what I'm trying to do in this book is to represent to you reality that all of you are neck deep in, right? The people, the institutions, the culture, the language that you all have grappled with already. And what I have to do, therefore, is defamiliarize you from it and then refamiliarize it in the way that I'm inviting you to see it. And so coinage is very important for doing that. So market world is my coinage for a complex of people and institutions that are kind of defined by what I think is the touchstone of the age, which is doing well by doing good. Right? I can help people, and I can stay on top. I can change the world, and I can keep things the same.
No sacrifice.
I can make a killing and make a difference. And that each of those things can actually reinforce each other, doing well by doing good by doing well. And so I wanted to scoop together a bunch of disparate things and actually make us see them as being part of the same phenomenon, okay? So billionaires, Zuck and Elon and Bezos all giving this money away and deciding how things should be, like kings without the coronation ceremony. That's certainly one important phenomenon. 22-year-olds who may have no money at all but want to start that poop to coffee social enterprise. In our conventional categories, they have nothing to do with billionaires giving a lot of money away. But I wanted us to see them as part of the same reality of kind of market-based solutions to fundamentally systemic problems. Then the very different phenomenon of thought leaders. I write about some of the people that I saw on stage, and some somewhat critically, which is, I believe that there are real thinkers out there who actually challenge power.
Intellectuals.
And public intellectuals, they used to be called. And I believe there's also this crop of people who, I call in the book and others have called thought leaders, which I do not mean in a positive way, who basically are fluffers for the rich and powerful.
And they're also self-appointed.
Correct. And basically, they come up with either completely kind of made-up frameworks or just very watered-down ideas that don't blame anybody, don't point fingers at the privileged, and basically tell women to lean in instead of fixing social problems. Like tell poor people to go to the one charter school they created in their city instead of having equal public schools for all. And so that phenomenon of those thinkers seems different from the billionaires. It seems different from the 22-year-old poop to coffee social entrepreneurs, but they're part of the story I'm trying to tell. And then you got all these ex-Goldman, McKinsey trained people who are now in charge of reducing poverty at foundations and nonprofits. Again, that's different from the other three phenomena, but it's again part of this idea, this ideology that the people who built the winners-take-all economy are the best positioned to help the losers from that economy. The arsonists are our most capable firefighters. And so that's part of market world. So I basically, and then one of my characters is Bill Clinton, who I spent time with. And Bill Clinton believed more than anybody in 1964 in changing the world through movements and policy and law, and actually people. And today, Bill Clinton believes maybe more than anybody in the world in changing the world by getting the Rockefeller Foundation and Goldman Sachs to build a playground for people that, were poisoned by Coca-Cola and putting Coca-Cola's name on it. And so I wanted to scoop together these disparate seeming things and describe them as a world. And many of you will recognize that people move between, those kids become the billionaires or work for them, and the thought leaders are the thinkers who guide a lot of these people. And to kind of, describe a world that I could then kind of travel through. And this book, therefore, became a kind of travelogue once I'd defined the country.
The book investigates how we arrived at market world historically, leading up to how people today are being groomed to see the private market as the way to spur change, and how things like Capitol Hill internships are now considered antiquated. As for the world we've arrived at today, you write this. The long-standing idea took root in the emerging commercial societies of urban Europe a few centuries ago. Its most famous statement is Adam Smith's declaration about the societal benefits of human selfishness. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. Beliefs like this cite trickle-down economics, that by a rich man serving his best interests, it serves those below him. And today, all of that has been adapted with what you refer to as the win-win culture that permeates tech and goodwill. Can you talk a little bit more about that win-win culture?
But I think part of where that was going is, so how many of you, be honest, because this is a semi-safe space, how many of you have used the word win-win unironically in the last year? How many of you plan to use it unironically after this talk? It's good, I'm having some impact. Look, win-win, if there's one concept underpinning the kind of bullshit culture that I'm trying to expose in the book. And I'm just being really real with you because that's what I do. It's the win-win. And the win-win on the surface is a lovely idea, which is why you all use it, because you're nice people. And it's like, why have one victory when you can have two? And it arose, it's a commercial idea in its origin, as you said, quoting Adam Smith. You have ice cream, I have money. I want ice cream, you want money. We do a deal.
Win-win.
Win-win, particularly with ice cream. That's not the problem. The problem is this idea has slowly colonized the very different sphere of social change and the pursuit of justice, which is not a win-win and is very unlike the ice cream situation. But now, in a world dominated by market fundamentalism as the kind of governing religion of the West over the last 40 years, in a world in which religion has gone down, people's attachment to community has gone down, the only thing that many people believe in is kind of these market values, either forthrightly or passively. What has happened is when we think about what to do about the fact that women have been excluded by patriarchy for hundreds of years, we start thinking of the ice cream metaphor, and that's how you get lean in, right? You get this kind of idea of yeah, we could sell a lean in product to women, we'll make money that way, the women will lean in, they'll make more money, some of them. And we forget what real change is. And we forget that actually, when you get into the area of social justice and social change, you actually don't need the powerful to help you win while they win. You need them to stop standing on your backs. And so one thing I want to say about Adam Smith is, we think of Adam Smith today as a radical person who had this radical market view. First of all, he was a much more complicated thinker, and all of his disciples have no idea what he actually said, but that's a whole other issue. But in the passage you wrote, he was laying out this kind of invisible hand thing, which is, really leave rich people alone, good things will happen. The win-win is actually a much, much more radical theory. The theory that is passively all around us today is much more radical than Adam Smith in the following way. It does not say leave rich people alone and good things will incidentally happen. It says put rich people in charge of social change because they and only they are capable of leading it.
Sounds familiar.
It does not frame social benefit as an incidental consequence of market exchange. It says the people who are good at market exchange also should run our schools, also should be in charge of feminism, also should be in charge of poverty policy, also should be in charge of climate. The lecturer at the UN on climate the other day was the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, who has branded himself as the face of conscious capitalism, which is like capitalism, except there's some random word in front of it. And while preparing for this speech over the last few months, lecturing the United Nations on climate change, Larry Fink's BlackRock bought, I think, 4 million additional shares of Exxon. Right? That's the win-win. The Adam Smith theory was just leave Larry Fink alone. This new theory is leave him alone and make him lecture the UN, make him an expert on how the world should address climate change. Make the arsonist, the chief, the fire chief.
Do you think that it's a colossal act of ego that these people think that they can solve the world's problems, or do you think that they really believe that they're uniquely primed to do so?
It sounds like ego to me. I mean, both are ego, right? I think there's a mix of motivations. I mean, I often talk about this Paulo Freire line as this kind of coalition of the naive and the shrewd. There are, among these kind of elite change makers, there's the shrewd end of the spectrum, which I think you see a lot in New York in finance, is folks who have a very clear understanding that a little bit of strategically done giving is a lubricant in the engine of continued taking.
Explain that.
November 18th, 2007, there's an email now made public by a Senate investigation from Goldman Sachs. This guy named Lucas Van something at Goldman Sachs, sends an email to Lloyd Blankfein, CEO, Gary Cohn, other illustrious people, saying, hey, New York Times story is coming tomorrow about Goldman Sachs, about us. It's balanced, i.e. it has stuff we don't like. It was basically about what they'd done in the mortgage crisis and it was a year early. It was a year before it ruined America, but they'd already avoided it for themselves while pushing toxic products on their own clients. They would end up paying a $5 billion fine for the thing that the New York Times was reporting that they were doing. So they knew it was not good. And he updates Blankfein on his conversations with the reporter leading up to the story coming out on the front page tomorrow. And number one item on the 5 bullet point item, because these people love bullet points, is GS Gives is not in the story. He had tried, but GS Gives, which is a new philanthropic project they hadn't yet announced, but were waiting to announce.
If Goldman Sachs gives.
And I just thought that, these people are very good at not having that stuff slip out, but because of the Senate investigation, we have the email, and it's just like this amazing cultural document. That's how it works. Big story coming out in the New York Times saying we did a bad thing that'll eventually cost us a $5 billion fine because it was so bad and helped millions of people lose their homes. Let's try to slip our charity project in there, right? There's a clear understanding. So that's the shrewd end of the spectrum, that a little bit of giving may just be a smokescreen for a kind of pillaging approach to the economy. But then you have the kind of stereotypically the Silicon Valley end of things, which is totally different, which to your question is, I think actually marked by a dangerous sincerity about their effort, about their ability to make the world a better place.
Why is the term social justice seen as something that is problematic in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, I tell this story of Emmett Carson, who had his own problem at the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. He's now out as part of, I think, a sexual harassment scandal there. And he told me about, he'd worked in foundations his whole life, African American, grew up in a tough neighborhood in Chicago and ended up rising to the heights of all these foundations. And he said, look, I worked in social justice my whole career. I used that term my whole career. Then he gets this job in Silicon Valley. He becomes Mark Zuckerberg's advisor and others in that world. And he said, it was made very clear to me very quickly, you don't say this word social justice around here. And I said, why? And he said, well, I think people out here, it sounds to them like you're taking from them. Which is actually correct. Yeah. And what I had learned from Emmett was something very important, which is rich and powerful people in our time really do want to help. But they have certain requirements for how they want to feel in their helping. They want to feel consulted, which they feel when they do things philanthropically, and they don't feel when government just takes their money and makes a collective decision about what to do. So they like charter schools. They don't like equally and adequately funded public schools. They like to feel useful and not blamed, right? So they don't like the Bernie Sanders kind of rhetoric around, or Facebook's a monopoly or Amazon's doing that. They don't like that. It doesn't make them feel good. But they're willing to help if you say, wow, you built Facebook. That's so amazing that you created a way for people to waste all this time. And maybe given that expertise, you can help the kids in Newark have a better education. They love that. They love that feeling of you're useful, you're not the problem. And what Emmett understood, because he's not a writer who can just say stuff, he's a guy who had to figure out how to speak to them to get them to give money away and help, is you have to shift the language. But shifting the language is not just shifting the language. It's shifting the whole thing. It's shifting the politics of it. Because you basically have to solve problems in ways that make them perpetrator-free. And
Is that possible?
so this is where, so I want to introduce you to this like theory I have, which is that there are two kinds of social problems. There are probably many kinds, but we're going to do two today. There's engine problems and there's crime scene problems. Okay? So some social problems are engine problems in that they are basically like an engine that's out of whack. Right? And you can go in and you can tighten this, replace this part, tweak here, tweak there, replace a belt, good to go. Okay, so let's say you're in Chicago public schools and there's some teachers who are really good at helping kids who have fallen behind on math, and there are other kids who are really far behind on math, but those teachers and students haven't been matched together, and a better algorithm and assessment could match them more effectively, and you could lift achievement for everybody. Yeah, that's a win-win. That's easy. That's an engine problem. The poverty in the south side of Chicago is not an engine problem. That's a crime scene problem. Crime scene problems are problems where someone has done something to someone else. What men have done to women over centuries is not an engine problem that needs to be tweaked. It's a crime that needs to be rectified. What white people have done to black people over centuries is not an engine problem. It's a crime scene problem. You don't show up at a crime scene and say, you know what, let's just move forward. Let's focus on solutions. Let's focus on what we can. Let's not make this about the past. Let's not blame anybody. When you show up at a crime scene, the most important thing to do is to look backward.
Forensically.
What happened here? Who did what to whom? What state is the victim in? Where is the perpetrator? And I have no problem with win-win solutions, engine solutions to engine problems. But what is really happening in our time when the winners of our age take over social change, and the entrepreneurial class becomes in charge of our schools, and the billionaires take over, our poverty policy, et cetera, is that they show up on crime scenes with the engineer mentality. And they try to strip away blame and the very idea of justice from the improvement of our society. And generosity is not a substitute for justice. It is not the same thing as justice. And when you put the people with most to lose from real change in charge of change, they change change.
Mm. Does hope for the future lie in returning the shaping of the world to politics and away from market world?
I know we're reaching the end, so I'm going to actually give you some hope. I think there's so much to be gloomy about in America right now. And I'm not sure, certainly in my lifetime, and maybe of anybody's lifetime in this room, that there's been a moment where the very fabric of who we are seems threatened. However, I want to suggest that we are actually living on the cusp, if we choose it, of an extraordinary time for the following reason. A lot of what I've written about in this book is bad ideas guiding our pursuit of a better society that have ruled this country for 30 or 40 years, right? Long before Orange Mussolini was on the scene. And bad ideas like the people who cause the problem should be in charge of solving them. Bad ideas like being rich is somehow some sort of moral compass that should give you the right to rule us. Bad ideas like markets solve everything. Bad ideas like, people who know spreadsheets and are sort of unique geniuses. And I don't think we could have gotten a president better suited to flamboyantly discredit the idea that rich people are going to save us any better than Donald Trump. And I'm serious about this. I think if Hillary Clinton would have been president, it would have been a lot better. It's the most obvious statement in history. But I think a lot of bad ideas would have survived her presidency.
Really?
Yeah. They would have been there before her, and they would have been there after. She may have opposed them, but her donors would have been marching on and staying on top. And we got to give Donald Trump great credit for flamboyantly discrediting the bullshit of the last few decades. Because I think no serious person after this presidency can think that billionaires are specially equipped to know what's what. And I hope we are now smart enough that those of us on the left are not looking for Oprah, Michael Bloomberg, Tom Steyer, Mark Zuckerberg, and other billionaires that we like a little more to save us. I hope we're actually learning and growing from this.
Who do you think would be a good
So I just want to say one more thing, which is, and I'll get there.
Y'all want to know that, right?
I'm going to endorse Debbie in a second. 100 years ago, we were in an age exactly like this, where it felt like things wouldn't change. We had basically billionaires deciding how things go. All these big foundations were being set up. Rockefellers and Carnegies were building the nation and screwing their workers, and people were being killed at their factories. Women couldn't vote. And
interracial marriage was illegal.
Correct. No civil rights, et cetera, et cetera. And very quickly, what must have felt very fast in that moment, it began to change. Now, it changed because of a world war, it changed because of a Great Depression, but frankly, we have pretty big things going on in the world right now that are catalytic if we choose them to be. And they entered an age of reform. They went from this kind of gilded age to an age of reform. And they shifted. It's not like they stopped being businesses, but they shifted the weight on their 2 feet from one to the other. And they shifted from being a private spirited age to a public spirited age. They shifted from solving problems alone to solving problems together. They shifted from an age of the heroic me to the kind of heroic we. And they built an FDA so there wouldn't be antifreeze in medicine anymore, which used to be the case. They made the workday 8 hours so that it wasn't 16. They got children out of factories. They built the interstate highway system. They electrified rural America. They built the modern world. And we built the modern world. And I think we're actually on the cusp of another age of reform. And I know it feels very elusive right now, but if you look at all the people running for office, all the women running for office, if you look at people who were not inspired by anything, even though there's plenty of evidence to be inspired over the last 30 years, but are inspired by this moment. I think we are living in a moment in which many of us are waking up to the realization that a society is only as good as our citizenship, our active citizenship. And you can't free ride on a republic. And an age that has taught young people to make the world better by starting a cupcake company that gives back, I think is calling in that lesson, and we're going back to the founding, and we're learning to be citizens again. And I think he, ironically, is the one who is going to make our citizenship great again.
I hope so, Anand. I really, really do. Who do you think is going to run against him?
I mean, I don't know. I'm watching with great interest to avoid my own deportation. I would say, I think what concerns me is it's going to have to be someone who is really good at politics, the way he's really good at politics. It may not sound like he's really good at politics, but he's really fucking good at politics, right? That stuff, when he was quiet and respectful of Christine Blasey Ford, and then the next day he wasn't, and we were all like, ugh, unhinged again? No. They got polling. They understood that they could flip it from, they understood that they could make this about elevating that feeling that a lot of white guys have of being silenced, which is a kind of interesting feeling, but anyway. They understood that if they framed it a certain way, coupled with Kavanaugh's anger, they could actually activate that feeling. Then they did that thing of like reaching white moms and like making them think about holding their son and fearing that your son's life will one day be, like, these people are very, very, very good at politics. Just because they can't read doesn't mean they're not good at politics. It's probably why they're good at politics. And I really think like my side is not that good at politics, frankly. I think Obama was very good at politics, but Obama's like a once in 50-year event. And I just look at the field and I feel that there's a lot of brilliant, capable people. I think Beto's an amazing figure. But I think it's going to need to be someone, going back to the very beginning of this conversation, who pulls off a very difficult double act, which is basically representing this rising new America, while in their cadences and their being able to speak to and connect to that still waking, not quite woke America. And when I look, to be totally blunt, when I see Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer as the two people we have elevated to represent half this country, the two best people we could find to represent half this country's political preferences, I think we are, playing checkers while they're playing chess. The two people running the Democratic Party should be the two most inspiring people in America. That's just obvious. Not the people best at raising money. And if we are not showing up in full force in this era with amazing, I mean, look at that, during the hearing with Dr. Ford, there was a real risk that 3 or 4 of those people, including Democrats, were going to die right there, just of old age, natural causes. And nothing against people who are, older than 100, but like, I'm sorry, the Democratic Party is the party of young, rising America. Half those people need to just quit. And you can sit and bitch and moan about Trump if you are doing everything in your power to get rid of the problems on your side. But we have basically like a party of 80-year-olds that is led by people who are good at raising money, that, in my view, either only speak to coastal elites and don't know how to connect, or only pander to their like rural Ohio district and don't know how to speak to, and Obama was really like a rare miracle because of his background and his own straddling in his life. And I really fear that that this is like such a ripe moment to be an opposition party, and it's a little bit of a milquetoast party. And a lot of it, I think, goes back to the idea that money has conquered everything in this society, including the party that is supposed to be the great check on free markets and capitalism.
Anand, have you ever considered running for office?
Not even a little, because for many reasons it wouldn't work, including the stuff I say all the time.
Anand Giridharadas.
Thank you.
Anand Giridharadas, his remarkable book, Winners Take All.